Here. I'm from Philadelphia. My name is Kimberly Blessing, and this is first of two talks I'll be giving today. This one's obviously more developer focused, so I'm assuming everybody here has at least some. So just for some background, there we go. I've been doing web development for over 20 years, so I'm telling you a little bit about my age right there. I've worked at companies like AOL and PayPal, which you might be familiar with. Comcast is the largest cable TV and internet provider in the United States. I've worked for them too. Interestingly, when I started at AOL, I had only been there for about 6 months when they were hit with a lawsuit from the National Federation for the Blind in the United States. And that was pretty much the first and biggest lawsuit that challenged accessibility when it came to technology. And so AOL had to actually retrofit their entire service to make it accessible for the blind. And that was a project I was involved in, so that's kind of how I got started with this. And I've been involved with the World Wide Web Consortium. I've worked on the CSS working group as well as with the Web Standards Project. So I tend to be really close to the browser makers and the folks who are making decisions about the standards. So any questions that you have or any ideas that you may have, hopefully I can answer the questions, but if you have ideas, I'd love to take them back to those working groups so that they can consider them. So let's just start off. Well, that doesn't want to work. This does. We have a little bit of an education problem, I think, when it comes to understanding accessibility. And in many cases, it starts with the reference materials that we use. This was a great tweet somebody posted on New Year's Day earlier this year. I love it when people spend New Year's Day kind of making their educational plan for the year. This person wanted to learn Angular, but the very first thing that they noticed is that in all of the example textbooks about Angular, nothing about accessibility is addressed. And in fact, the example code in the book isn't accessible. So it's not even providing a great example of how to do this well. So we want to try to address some of that today. But we have to talk about first who's going to benefit from the work that we're putting into this. And of course, the first thing everybody always thinks about are the folks who have some sort of disability. And sometimes those folks prefer to be referred to as differently abled, not necessarily disabled. There are a number of categories in which somebody may have some sort of disability. It could be related to their vision, it could be related to hearing, it could be cognitive, it could be mobility related. Some people don't always self-identify as being disabled. And that's a very interesting category. Anybody with any kind of aging parent has probably seen this firsthand, where your parent doesn't want to admit that there's something failing about their faculties. So for example, I have a grandmother who refuses to wear a hearing aid, despite the fact that the only way I can communicate with her now is to write notes on paper to her. Things change over time. And it's also possible, of course, to experience a disability of some sort temporarily. You may break your arm and not be able to type with both hands, or it might be less convenient to try to type with both hands. So disabilities can come and go, and we need to think about a wide range of ways in which people are going to interact with technology. Then there's a whole nother category of side benefits, and we saw this, I think, when things like curb cuts were introduced, ramps and whatnot. So folks who were in wheelchairs definitely benefited from those sorts of physical changes in the environment, but so too did mothers with strollers or individuals who were running and didn't want to have to make a jump onto a step of some sort. So we can think about those who are just differently tech equipped. And I have some of my favorite examples in here, and these are just a few. The first one here, this is something called a chord keyboard. This is the Twiddler. I actually have used one of these for probably now 20-some years. I didn't bring mine with me, but I used to do a lot of mobile computing back in the days when that meant carrying a laptop in a backpack on your back with a car battery. And in those days, you needed some sort of interface. A chord keyboard was nice and portable. It fit into the palm of your hand. And the premise is that, like playing the guitar, the combination of keys that you press will trigger different letters. And then the device itself has a gyroscope built in, so it's more like a joystick instead of a mouse. So this is just sort of a very different type of interface, but I've seen a number of individuals who have other types of mobility impairments make use of devices like these. So this is just a different way of interacting with technology. Of course, we have pen-based computing. There was the Windows XP-based system that came out, I think now well over 10 years ago, maybe even close to 15 years ago. This was probably the first viable pen-based platform. We have many more of them today, but very often we don't take into consideration what those pen interactions are like. They're not quite the same as touch, nor are they quite the same as a mouse-based interaction. So the control is a little bit different. And then finally, of course, mobile devices have just proliferated like crazy. We're now wearing them on our arms. But even when we think about gaming systems, things like the Microsoft Kinect, we end up with a whole range of touch-based, gesture-based, voice-based interactions. And so when we start to think about how we're developing web applications and all the different ways somebody may interact with that, it's really important for us to know how the technology is going to respond. So the great thing is that the more you stick to the standards, typically the better off you are in this regard, because you know that the various manufacturers are going to try to meet those standards. So you're kind of future-proofing your applications if you're going down that path. All right, so that's sort of the general background. So what is it that we can do better exactly when it comes to developing our applications? Some of these things you've probably heard before, so we can roll right through those, but please feel free to stop me at any point and ask any questions. I'm going to turn on my screen reader at this point. There it is. Okay, so you're going to hear one type of assistive technology. Has anybody ever used a screen reader before? We've got two folks who raised their hands. So a screen reader is a device typically associated with folks who are low vision or blind. It's going to read the content of the screen that I'm focused on to us. So you'll hear it. I have it set relatively slowly, so hopefully you'll be able to make sense of it. The interesting thing about a screen reader I found when I started learning how to use one, again, years ago when I was at AOL and we were retrofitting the service to try to work better with screen readers, I found that it was actually just really convenient as sort of a power computing user to keep it on all the time. I could load up a web page, a news article, and let it read it to me while I was busy doing something else. So it kind of facilitated a different type of multitasking for me, and I'm not blind. So again, there are different ways in which some of these technologies can be used. I've seen many of the voicing technologies on mobile devices now being used by non-disabled people. Again, so we're finding ways of taking these different pieces of technology and applying them for different reasons. So, with that, there we go. Semantic markup bullet narrated semantic elements that could contain your content. Use them often bullet. I'm going to stop it there. Oh. It doesn't want to stop. Don't stop the screen reader, it's the lesson. All right, there we go. All right, I'm going to mute it because I can't press escape clearly to stop it. So the one I think that everybody is likely most familiar with, and the refrain that's always used, I think, in every presentation when it comes to accessibility, is the reminder to use semantic markup. So especially when it comes to many of the frameworks and libraries that we're using today, a lot of the built-in widgets do not use semantic markup because when people build frameworks and libraries, they don't know how you intend to actually make use of that code. So they tend to stick to the semantically neutral div and span, and that's fine. There are definitely ways of taking those and making those those elements accessible, depending on the type of application that you're writing. The only thing is that you end up having to write a lot more code. So it may, in fact, be easier to go in and if you're working in an MVC framework, for example, rewrite your reviews using semantic markup, and you'll end up using less code, and you'll get the benefit of all of that accessibility goodness baked in. It's going to keep turning itself back on. All right, so just a couple of brief examples that I've seen in the wild. Up at the very top, div class headline with some text inside of it rather than using one of the headings. And there's heading 1 through 6, so many different levels there to choose from. The great thing about headings is that somebody using a screen reader and many other assistive devices, they can get a nice hierarchy of the web page or of the application and jump to different sections very easily. So even if you're creating something like a banking application where you may have a list of transactions on one side and a list of actions that somebody could take within their account, those headings will give them ways to easily jump from one section to the other. The second example, creating a table out of divs. Every time I see one of the Angular JS plugins to create sortable or scrollable tables, this one always pains me because I just think about how much CSS and how much JavaScript is going into doing what the browser can do natively in a very little bit of code. Now, yes, I know it's hard sometimes to create a sortable table if you're not working with something that's semantically neutral. But with all of the different data elements, custom data attributes that we have available to us now, this should get easier and easier in time. All right, so we can also do something like give more context. And I think that there's been sort of an effort to strip down a lot of web pages and not put a lot of extra content in there. But when it comes to creating an application, you oftentimes need to give more information about what you're intending the user to do. And so we need to include more instructional text, but where do you put it? So sometimes you can work it into the user interface and it's useful for everyone, but sometimes you need to put in instructions that may be specific just to those folks who are using a screen reader, for example. And in those cases, the one thing that I've always heard is I can't put that text into my application. If I hide it off screen, Google is going to penalize me. And I think if you're writing an application, especially if it's fronted by some sort of login, Google's probably not logging in to look at that anyway. So we're kind of conflating content-based website concerns with application concerns. And in this case, they really are decoupled. So if you're creating an application to hide text off screen so that you have additional information for a user, it's really not going to hurt you at all. And in fact, it can be a very good thing. And then I'll also just mention, of course, another one of the constant refrains, make sure images have alternate text. And we can load up some examples to see why if anybody doesn't quite understand that one. But also loading images within the markup when they're contextually relevant. So this is something that I've seen in a number of applications where there's an image that's being referenced by copy, but the image is only being loaded by the CSS. And so therefore, there's no alternative text about the image. And so sometimes the references don't quite make sense. So here's an example of something that can be really, really simple to implement. I think everyone these days, when they implement some type of responsive website or web application, ends up with what many people call a hamburger menu. It's sort of 3 lines that when you tap it, it then expands into some sort of menu system. Very often, that little icon has no text associated with it. And that becomes kind of a problem because how would anybody know if they're only hearing a web page that that's what they're supposed to trigger in order to see all the navigation. So we can put instead this word menu inside of whatever it is. In this case, I've used that div. So it's not, in this case, semantically important. But the word menu at least is there. And I've used this class called accessibly hidden. And you'll see some variant of this class name in many different frameworks. Bootstrap has it. The HTML5 boilerplate includes something like it. And generally, when you look at the CSS, there's some really large block of code that seems kind of ugly. It's very brute force. But basically what the developer is attempting to do here is use every mechanism possible to ensure that that text will never show up on the screen, that it will always be hidden off screen, that even if that object should appear on screen, that it's very small, so they're setting the height and width to 1 pixel. And so this is just going to assure that that copy, that text is never seen, unless, I guess, CSS is turned off. But this combination works very, very well and can be used for all sorts of instructions. This type of approach can be used for things like hint text in form fields, for example, or it could just be used as an introduction to what type of application somebody has just navigated into. I think Google Docs and well, the various Google applications oftentimes use this type of technique in order to help folks understand the various keyboard commands that they could be using rather than trying to actually tab individually through all of the different tools like bold and italic and bullets and whatnot. So that's one way in which we can include additional context for users. I did put the image references down here at the very bottom. And so you can see in the case of something like a company logo, to actually explicitly have alternate text that says company name or company name logo, that's just going to help explain what that image is. In the case of something like a background that's not really very important, why it be loaded as an image, I don't know. But should you have any kind of design element that's not really crucial to being described, what is important is to include an empty alt attribute. And I think this is oftentimes what gets forgotten. Again, this is one of the things I've seen in a number of JavaScript frameworks when the various widgets are producing the views. If they're loading an image, there's just no alt attribute included there. And so you have to go in and edit those views, decide either which data you want to pull in or leave it empty. And what that will mean is that the screen reader won't spend time identifying the fact that there is an image there, and it will not read off the file name. It'll simply say image and keep going. Everything good there so far? All right. So we need to identify controls clearly, and we can do this by adding the role attribute in our markup. So I think most often what I see, and I've got a little code example here for this one. So oftentimes you'll see a div or a span with just an X inside of it. And so this is maybe being used as a close icon on a modal window that's being overlaid on top of something else. When we try to load this in a screen reader, there's not much to see, first of all, obviously. And now the screen reader doesn't want to read it. Okay. Okay, so it's just telling me there's an X on the screen. That's all I've got. Just X. So chances are, by this point, anybody who uses an assistive device frequently has heard this or encountered this often enough that they may know what it does. But I have not, for example, been told that this is actually something that I can take action on. It's just reading the letter X to me. So I could help folks out by saying, well, this is in fact some kind of button that you can take action on. And in order to do that, I will add a role of button. So now it's just told me I have a button and it's labeled X. Button X. So that's a little bit better. But if I press the tab key, I can't actually focus on that X. And what I ideally want to see is something that if I'm looking at the screen, I know that I can press enter or the space bar to take an action on. And so in order to do that, we're going to give it a tab index. And so very often just tab index 0 will make this div recognized within the overall DOM as something that can take focus. So it's still telling me that it's button X, but now when I press the tab key, You can perhaps see the thin outline that's surrounding it. Now I haven't added any other CSS to try to give this an actual size, so it's quite large, but I now have something that I can see, I'm focused on, and I could take action on. Now the last thing is reading the letter X is not particularly helpful, so we can change the label for this as well. And I'll use the ARIA label attribute. So ARIA is the Accessible Rich Internet Application specification. And what I'm going to say is that instead of reading out just the content that's inside of this div, also let me know that the label for this thing is the word close.
Test page, button close.
Test page, button close.
I'm test page document, button close.
So now I know that I've got a button, it's going to close whatever the thing is, and I've got focus on it, so I know I can take action. So this is a quick and easy way of making sure that a very small interactive piece of the application is recognized correctly by assistive devices. Now, of course, this is just the markup. There's likely going to be JavaScript here that's going to add some sort of event listener to then perform whatever action needs to happen. But just these 3 additional HTML attributes can make this fully recognized by all the different technologies that might want to interact with it. And so there it is again, all put together. Does that make sense? All right. Here's a slightly longer example. So things like tabs and accordion widgets. We see these pretty frequently in various applications. So something that looks like this visually, a set of tabs. These can be, in some cases, kind of difficult to navigate if you're not sure how to do this. I'm pressing the tab key in order to get to the very first tab, the one that's selected. And then from here, I need to know to use the arrow keys in order to get to the next one. So tab is not going to take me to the next one. The arrow keys are going to do this instead. So every time I'm pressing the arrow key, it's reading off the next tab to me. And then from here, if I were to tell it to keep reading, it's going to read the content of the selected tab. And accordions work more or less the same way. By default, most people don't think about what kinds of markup they need to add in order to make these accessible, so we'll take a look at that now. So if you start off with a set of tabs, some folks will write JavaScript to dynamically create the tabs. Some people will put the markup to make the tabs in their file. I don't have a preference on how you do it, but when you do that, oh, I'm going to go to the next slide because that's not the one I thought it was. The one that we're looking, I'm sorry, the one that we're looking at is actually for an accordion. So somehow I got my slides backwards. In the case of an accordion, where we may have some type of headline, when you click on the headline, it then opens a panel. You may click on the headline again and it would collapse the panel. These tend to just be a stack of headlines and content wrapped in some sort of container like a div. And so in that case, the headline itself gets a role of tab. So here's the interesting thing. Even though roles may describe one specific type of functionality, you can use them in many other cases. So something like an accordion can use tab-based roles. The context is more or less the same for somebody using an assistive technology. So the overall group, I'm sorry, I should have started here. The overall group, in this case, sitting inside of a div, has a role of tab list. And that's going to trigger the assistive technology to understand that all of these things together have some sort of tab trigger and then some sort of content associated with the tab. The trigger has the role of tab on it. And then the div that's containing the actual content has tab panel. So we have a tab list, tabs, and then tab panels. And that's really the core piece of HTML we have to add in this case. We can add a few more things, though, to help users understand the relationship between the title and the content. And we're going to do that through the ARIA, again, these ARIA attributes. So ARIA controls is going to identify the fact that this is a control. ARIA selected will tell us which one is currently active, as well as ARIA expanded will say whether or not the content associated with it is expanded. And then we use ARIA labeled by on the content block itself to indicate which heading it relates to. And then the ARIA hidden tag as well on the content to help folks know whether or not that thing is open. So again, somehow I've kind of mixed these up. I must have been playing around with this before I copied and pasted all the code into here. So we've got a headline called section 1, and headline 1 is supposed to be expanded. It's the one that's selected at the moment. And it is related to UI ID 2, which is this panel here, although at the moment this panel, as you can see, is set to false. So as a user is interacting with these different elements, the JavaScript needs to ensure that it's changing the state for each one of these attributes. Otherwise, all of the right triggers will not take place. Let me go back to the page. So even though this was for the accordion, we'll go back, we'll take a look at some tabs. Okay, so it read off the name of the tab. It said that it was 2 of 3, so we have 3 tabs there. So it was selected. Oop. That time, let's go back. So it's saying collapsed and then selected. So I definitely have my code backwards. It shouldn't be saying collapsed, it should say expanded at this point. So I wrote something backwards in there. Yeah, it said collapsed and again. So I have something wrong in my JavaScript that's causing that to do the opposite of what it should be doing. Okay. Well, that one I didn't quite get right. So sometimes this isn't as easy as it looks. Thus, it's really important to make sure you test whatever it is that you're developing when you start to make use of these ARIA roles. But that's, we'll kind of skip that and maybe come back to it if there's some time and maybe debug that one. Okay. So label form elements. Whenever we create applications, we're going to make use of form elements. And again, hopefully we're using the correct semantic markup for these. So these should be fairly straightforward, but I do find that there are a few cases that folks don't quite understand. So the easy ones are when you have just a standard single line input, some sort of drop down select element, or a large chunk of text, a text area. In order to make these accessible, we use the label attribute, the label element. The for attribute that goes along with it should relate to the ID that's placed onto the input element itself. So these are the types of examples that are frequently in books, and I think they don't quite demonstrate how the label and the input element necessarily relate, which is why things like checkboxes and radio buttons are somewhat confusing. So I'm going to go on to that because that's where I think we need to have a little bit of a chat. So when you have a series of checkboxes or radio buttons, the relationship between the label and the input is a little bit different because typically you have a larger question or motive to having that set of checkboxes or radio buttons. So in this particular case, I'm using radio buttons and I'm asking, do you like ice cream? So the question and the thing that I want to make sure that is read or made accessible to users is in fact the question, do you like ice cream? because otherwise the answers of yes and no don't really make any sense. So typically what I've seen is that folks will put the question, do you like ice cream, maybe in some sort of headline or a paragraph, but it doesn't guarantee that the user is going to hear that. When the user tabs through the web page or navigates through the form, they're instead just going to hear yes and no, and then they need to start to investigate what's going on in the larger context of the application in order to get to that question. So we use the field set element in order to group all of these things together and say this is all one piece of information. And legend for the field set is how we're actually going to acknowledge this is the overall question that has to do with all these different answers. And so then when we have the different inputs and their associated labels, we now have yes, no, do you like ice cream? And now we get into a really great case for how the for attribute relates to the ID on the input. Because when you have a radio element or a checkbox, name is the value that we're passing to the server, is the name of the input that we're passing to the server, but there is a separate explicit value associated with that. And you can't just take the name ice cream and make that your ID because you're going to end up using that multiple times for however many checkboxes or radio buttons you have. So instead, for the ID, you may combine that name and value pair and make that ice cream yes and ice cream no. So now you can see how these two things actually tie into one another. So when I select no, I don't like ice cream, and I don't know who would ever select that, but if you selected no, I don't like ice cream, then the assistive technology is going to say no, do you like ice cream? So that's how all of that goes together. This is one way of associating inputs and labels, and this is called explicit association. There's also implicit association, which is where label, the label element is simply wrapped around the input as well as the actual word. And in this case, you don't necessarily have to have an explicit value either in your markup. This is probably less popular these days. Most people will explicitly assign their labels. Okay, so I think the thing that folks really love to do is recreating form controls. I think designers sometimes get carried away. They want either everything to look like iOS, whether you're on iOS or not, or they just enjoy spending the time to make really beautiful controls that are perhaps larger than what you can get natively in the browser. But when you do this, you have to get very creative with CSS and JavaScript in order to make sure that they're fully accessible, and that means you're going to end up reproducing a lot of the default browser behavior. So I suggest don't do it unless you really, really absolutely have to. And so this is an example of recreating form elements that is actually kind of interesting. So what we have here is a form where a user can select what they want to search for. They can include or not include certain parameters, television, internet, and phone. So they're looking for information about these things. And these are not obviously default browser checkboxes. These are graphics that are being loaded instead. And in this particular case, they're not even using form elements for any of this. They're using a lot of spans and sending AJAX requests back and forth to the server every time somebody selects or deselects one of these. And let me just show you what this code looks like. So this is quite interesting. There's a good bit of additional text here. So they're using ACC hidden for that accessibly hidden text that I had been talking about earlier. So even though they have some on-screen instructions, they have additional off-screen instructions. And when you get to one of those individual selectable items, so for example, television, this is actually a link. It's a link they're loading that graphic as via CSS as a background image for it. And then they're toggling its state. So by default, when the web page loads, it is set to not selected. And then when the JavaScript kicks in, it's supposed to then automatically check it, and this state should change. And the only additional control that has to be used here is this thing called ARIA Live, which is a way of telling the assistive technology every time this DOM element changes, read off what's taking place. And we're using the value of polite. That way, if the user is busy doing something else, the change in state here will wait until the rest of the content has been read before indicating that this needs to change. So for example, if the user tabs onto this control and it's still reading the word television, but they've already pressed the enter key to change the state, it'll finish reading the word television before saying selected or not selected. And to give you an idea of what that's like in real time. Of course it's going to reload. There we go. And I don't know, I did notice a bug in it this morning, so I don't know if they've had a chance to fix it. Probably not, because they're 5 hours behind us. Oh, there it goes, it is fixed. All right, internet selected link is what it just said. So that's letting us know that this thing is selected. If I change the state, it just said not selected. It's something fairly small, but it's important in this particular case because this is a major control for how somebody would actually try to navigate this particular area of the web page. So there's one way of solving that challenge, and there are many, many others. Oh. All right. Along with this, managing tab focus. Sometimes you need to make sure that users stay within a particular area of your application. This often happens with things like modals, where you may launch some sort of dialog box. There may be a form inside of that. It's possible that a user may tab outside of it. And the big concern there is that if they end up back in the overall web page, it may be difficult to get back into that modal in order to close it. Or they may not even know that they're inside of a modal. When you have multiple panes for an application, this can also be a concern. So you want to make sure that you're not hiding that focus, that dotted line that I showed earlier, or in Chrome, it's kind of a blue glow behind certain selectable items, unless you have another very visible means for showing folks where they are. You want to make sure that you follow some sort of logical reading order so that it's easy for folks who are both sighted as well as disabled to understand where they are in a particular page or application. And like I said, you'll want to make sure that the focus stays within those modal windows. And so we'll hop back over here for an example of this. So I've just activated this dialog. Okay, close link, there we go. So it just told me that I have a closed link that I'm currently hovered on. So it's told me that I'm on the pricing and other information page. And now I'm back to the closed link. So I have two options. I can either read the content or I can close this. I'm not being bounced back to the page behind all of this at any point. So I know what my options are. And of course can close it, and now I'm back into the rest of my web page. So it's keeping me in the context of that, not that this is necessarily an application, but it's keeping me in the context of the functionality, and I'm not drifting away from it and then trying to figure out where I am. Oh. So just a few resources that are particularly useful if you're trying to do this in your applications. First of all, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Again, even though they primarily focus on traditional document-based websites, there are still very helpful pointers on how to use the ARIA ARIA labels and then the roles in order to make applications accessible. DQ Systems and the Paciello Group are two consulting firms that do a lot of advocacy. Both have really great blogs and hold pretty much monthly webcasts if you want to join those and learn more about these topics. Marcy Sutton, who's at Google, works on the Angular JS team, and she is a huge advocate for accessibility. She started an accessibility guide specifically for Angular. So if you are writing with that particular framework, she has lots of information on how to make the various controls and plugins accessible. And then if you just want to have a better idea as to what's happening in Scotland, I found out about the Scottish Accessible Information Forum. They have a very interesting blog with some additional tips and tricks as well that I found helpful. So you can check all of those out. And that's all I've got for you. So please make your websites and your web applications accessible. I appreciate it, and so do many other folks out there on the web. Thank you.
I'm not sure we've got time for any questions.
Okay.
But it's just we're on a quite tight schedule here. But if anybody wants to speak to Kimberly afterwards,
Yeah.
you'll be around at lunch
I'll be here all day.
and coffee. Yeah, yeah. All right.